By the time Miriam Vale reached the cabin above Bitterroot Pass, the lower half of her wedding dress had frozen into a bell of ice. Each step drove the rigid skirt against her knees. The satin had been white when Owen Pike abandoned her below the timberline. Now it was gray with mud and snow, stiff around her boots. The driver had not climbed down from his box. "Rourke's place is up that cut," he had said, pointing his whip toward a trail almost erased by the storm. "Mile and a half. You were paid to take me to his door." "I was paid to get you over the pass before the road closed." Then he had tossed her trunk into the ditch, snapped the reins, and left her beneath a darkening sky. That had been hours ago. Now, smoke twisted from a stone chimney less than 30 yards away. Between Miriam and the porch lay a clearing drifted knee-deep in snow. She dragged her trunk another 6 feet before the handle tore loose. She fell backward, the frozen skirt trapping her legs, and struck the ground hard enough to flash white across her vision. "Get up!" The command sounded like her father, though he had been dead 11 months. Miriam planted both palms in the snow, her fingers barely bent. She pushed herself onto her knees and used the ruined trunk as a brace. The cabin door opened. A man stepped onto the porch. He was taller than the doorway and built like someone accustomed to carrying what horses refused. A rifle hung in one hand, pointed at the ground. A pale scar ran from the left side of his jaw beneath his beard and collar. He set the rifle inside and crossed the clearing. Miriam forced herself upright before he reached her. She had spent too many years being lifted, shifted, and spoken around as though her body were freight. She would not greet her husband from the ground. If husband was what he was. Amos Greeley's letter had called Silas Rourke a respectable trapper of sober habits seeking a capable wife. Her stepbrother Walter had laughed over the word respectable. Silas stopped several paces away. Snow caught in his beard and dark hair. His eyes were gray-green, alert and tired. "Where's Pike?" "Gone." "You walked from the lower bend?" "He left me there." Silas looked toward the vanished trail. Something cold entered his face. Then he studied the frozen skirt. "Can you feel your feet?" "I can walk." "That wasn't what I asked." She tried to curl her toes. Nothing moved. "No." He turned, opened the cabin door, and said, "Inside." Miriam bent for the trunk. "Leave it. It has everything I own. It can wait 5 minutes." He carried it to the porch with one hand, then came back for her. "I can manage," she said. He did not argue. He walked beside her. When the ice caught her skirt and pitched her forward, his hand closed around her upper arm. He released her as soon as she found her balance. Heat rolled over Miriam when she crossed the threshold. The cabin smelled of pine, coffee, lamp oil, and stew. Snowshoes hung above the door. Ropes, traps, files, and labeled tins occupied the walls. A canvas curtain screened a narrow bed in one corner. Another hid a storage alcove beside the stove. Silas barred the door and faced her. In the firelight, the scar on his neck curved beneath his jaw like a burn left by a chain. His gaze settled on the frozen hem. He drew a knife. The blade was broad and sharp enough to catch a white line of firelight. Miriam backed into the door. Silas stepped toward her. "Cut off that dress." "What?" "The dress. Cut it off." Every warning she had heard crowded into the room. No law above the pass. No neighbors for miles. A broker's fee already paid. A woman delivered to a stranger who expected something in return. Her hand found the iron latch. The door was barred. Even if she lifted the crosspiece, she could not run 10 yards in the frozen skirt. Silas saw her reach behind herself and stopped. For the first time, he looked from the ice to her face. "You think I'm ordering you to undress for me?" Miriam said nothing. Silas turned the knife and offered her the handle. "You can hold it if that helps. I don't know you." "No. You paid for a wife." His brow tightened. "I paid Greeley for a winter housekeeper." The words landed without meaning. Silas lowered the knife. "Whatever he told you can wait. Your boots are frozen to the cloth. If it thaws against your skin, you'll lose heat faster. If we pull it, we may take skin." He sheathed the blade, took a red wool blanket from a peg, and laid it across a chair. Then he dragged the chair near the stove, set a low stool before it, and knelt. Not tenderly or ceremoniously. He went down like a man repairing harness in bad weather, quickly, and with no concern for how it looked. "Sit." Miriam stayed by the door. His jaw worked once. "Mrs. Vale." He looked up. "Miriam Vale." "Miss Vale, then. You may cut the cloth yourself, but your hands are blue, and you can't close the fingers on your right hand. Decide before pride costs you flesh." The bluntness gave her something solid to resist. Miriam crossed the room and lowered herself onto the chair. The frozen skirt struck the floor with a hollow crack. Silas held out the blanket without looking at her. She wrapped it around her shoulders and drew the edges together. Only then did he unsheath the knife. "I'm cutting below the knee," he said. "Nothing above it. If I need to touch your boot, I'll tell you first." She watched every movement. He slid 2 fingers between the satin and her left boot, angled the blade away from her skin, and sawed through the frozen cloth. The first cut sounded like tearing canvas. A curved panel fell to the floor. "I need to lift your heel." Miriam nodded. His palm closed around the back of the boot, not her ankle. He raised it and cut the fabric trapped beneath. The pressure around her calves loosened. Pain drove into her feet. She sucked in a breath and gripped the blanket. Silas glanced up. "Pain is better than nothing." "I know." Within a minute, the ruined hem lay in stiff pieces around him. Silas placed the knife on the workbench, beyond his reach. "You can remove the boots?" "I think so." He crossed to the storage alcove. "I'll heat water. There are dry clothes behind the curtain. Shirt, drawers, socks. They may fit badly, but badly is warmer than wet." "What about you?" "I'll face the wall." Silas saw her hesitation. "There's a hook inside. Tie the curtain shut." Only after he turned away did Miriam move. Her fingers fumbled with the swollen buttons of the bodice. One snapped free and skittered across the floor. Silas did not turn. He stood at the stove with his back to her, pouring water into a basin. His left shoulder sat slightly lower than the right. Miriam gathered the blanket close and stumbled behind the curtain. There was indeed a hook. She fastened the canvas with a rawhide strip. Cedar shelves held folded blankets, beans, soap, lamp wicks, and 2 stacks of men's clothing. No lace, no hooks designed to pinch a waist into another shape. Her wet shift clung to her skin. The corset beneath it had chafed her ribs raw. She fought the laces, but her fingers slipped. "Silas Rourke." "Yes." "The laces are knotted." A pause. "Do you want the knife?" "I can't use my hands well enough." Another pause. "I can cut them, only if you ask." Miriam closed her eyes. No man in her father's wheel shop had ever asked permission before moving her, taking a tool from her hand, or deciding what labor her body owed. She loosened the curtain enough to expose the corset laces while holding the blanket across her front. "Cut them." His boots crossed the floor. "I'm behind you." The warning came before his touch. 2 fingers lifted the wet laces from her skin. The knife passed once between them. The pressure around her ribs vanished so suddenly she nearly sagged against the shelf. Silas stepped back. "Done. Thank you." His retreating footsteps were the only answer. Miriam dressed slowly. The flannel shirt reached nearly to her knees. The trousers were too long and broad at the waist, but the rope provided held them. When she opened the curtain, steam rose from a basin near the stove, and a mug waited on the table. Silas stood at the hearth ladling stew into a bowl. He looked at her once, briefly, to confirm she was clothed. "Sit near the stove." He placed the basin at her feet. Warm, not hot, slowly. Miriam removed the borrowed socks and lowered one foot into the water. Pain ripped up her leg. She bit down on a cry. Silas crouched far enough away not to crowd her. "Any white patches?" "I don't think so." "Move your toes." She tried. One twitched. Again. This time 3 moved. Silas released a breath. Good. The word carried more relief than his face did. He pushed the stew within reach, then opened a wooden folding screen between her chair and the rest of the cabin. "What is that for?" "So you can sleep without waking to a strange man looking at you." Miriam watched him spread a bedroll near the front door, on the colder side of the room. "There is a bed." "Yes." "Whose?" "Mine. And you expect me to take it?" "I expect you not to die after climbing the pass in frozen clothes." He said it while checking the rifle above the door, as if weather rather than courtesy had settled the matter. Miriam looked at the stew. "What did Greeley tell you?" Silas's hand stopped on the rifle strap. "That you were a widow seeking paid work, good with accounts, strong enough for winter." He looked over his shoulder. "Nothing about a wedding." The room seemed to tilt. "He told me you had chosen me for a wife." Silas went still. Fury passed through him without noise, tightening his jaw and hands. "We'll read the letters in the morning," he said. "You believe me?" "I believe Greeley is capable of it." "That isn't the same thing." "No." He looked at the shredded wedding dress. "It isn't." He gathered the frozen pieces and placed them near the hearth without smiling at the lace or touching them with contempt. Miriam ate 3 spoonfuls before realizing how hungry she was. The broth was dark with onions and dried mushrooms. She finished the bowl in silence. Silas did not watch her eat. He lowered the lamp, fed the stove, and sat with his back against the barred door, the rifle within reach. "You should take the bed," Miriam said. "I sleep better by the door." "Is that true?" "Tonight, it is." Behind the folding screen, the mattress rustled beneath her. The blankets were clean and smelled of cold air. Miriam lay fully dressed and waited for Silas to approach, for boots on the floor, for the screen to move. Nothing came. Once, deep in the night, she heard him rise and add wood to the stove. He moved quietly enough that he must have believed she slept. When dawn thinned the darkness, Miriam woke to a pale bar of light along the floor. The cabin was warm. Beyond the screen, Silas slept against the front door with his coat rolled behind his head and one hand near the rifle. He had stayed on the cold boards all night. The storage curtain remained tied exactly as she had left it. Miriam lay still, listening to the first crackle of morning in the stove, and understood that the most frightening thing Silas Rourke had done since she arrived was keep his word. At first light, Silas set 2 letters on the table and asked Miriam to read hers aloud. He had already brought in her trunk. It stood beside the stove with a split corner and a stripe of dried mud across the lid. Her ruined wedding dress hung from a roof peg, the severed hem thawing into a bucket below it. Miriam sat in one of his flannel shirts with a blanket over her knees. Her feet burned inside dry socks. The pain was unpleasant, but it proved the cold had not taken anything permanent. Silas placed a tin cup near her hand, then sat across from her. He had not shaved. A faint crease marked one side of his face, where his coat had served as a pillow. The two envelopes looked nearly identical. Both bore Amos Greeley's careful black script and the blue stamp of his employment office in St. Louis. Miriam unfolded hers. She did not want Silas to hear the hope that had once lived between the lines, so she made her voice flat. Dear Miss Vale, Mr. Silas Rourke, a prosperous trapper established near Bitterroot Pass, has reviewed the particulars supplied by your family and accepts you as his intended wife. He requests a woman of sound health, practical habits, and Christian character. Transportation will be arranged. Upon your arrival, the marriage agreement will be considered binding in good faith, with formal vows to be witnessed at the first lawful opportunity. Silas's eyes narrowed. Keep going. Miriam read the next paragraph. Mr. Rourke has paid all placement and travel expenses. In exchange, you agree to maintain his household and honor the duties expected of a frontier wife. Should you refuse the arrangement after departure, the sum of $46 will become a debt against you or your nearest male relation. Silas held out his hand. She passed him the page. He read the paragraph himself, once and then again. I paid $18. For what? A placement fee for a winter employee, $6 to Greeley, $12 to cover your rail and stage fare. Miriam looked at the torn trunk beside the stove. He charged my brothers $20. Silas raised his gaze. They told me it was the cost of finding a husband willing to accept me. Walter took it from my share of father's tools before he sold the shop. For several seconds, only the stove spoke between them. Silas slid his own letter across the table. Miriam read silently at first. The opening described her as Mrs. Miriam Vale, a childless widow from a family of tradesmen. It said she was experienced in cooking, laundry, household accounts, and the ordinary obedience expected in isolated service. Her employment would last 6 months at $8 a month, less travel and placement deductions. Either party could end the agreement for violence, theft, drunkenness, or refusal to work. There was nothing about marriage, nothing about a permanent claim, nothing about Miriam receiving any of the wages Greeley had promised in her name. At the bottom, beside Silas's signature, Greeley had written a second name in a stiff imitation of her hand. Miriam Vale Rourke. She touched the ink. I didn't sign this. I know. You've never seen my signature. I've seen enough forged supply orders to recognize a man writing slower than he thinks. She examined the false name more closely. The capital V had been copied from the letter her brothers sent to the broker. Greeley had added Rourke with a flourish, as if a woman's future could be completed by attaching one man's name to another man's pen. What did my family tell him? Silas asked. That I knew household work, that I was healthy. Miriam folded his letter along its existing crease, that I would not be missed. His expression did not change, but the fingers of his left hand curled against the tabletop. The last two did not close all the way. Miriam noticed. She pretended not to. Silas took both letters and laid them side by side. There was no marriage. Not in your agreement. Not anywhere. A broker can't marry two people by mail. He can leave a woman 3 days from the nearest town with no money and tell everyone she belongs to the man who paid for her. Silas met her eyes. Yes. The simple answer angered her more than reassurance would have. He understood the trap because he could see it. He did not ask her to believe that paper and distance were harmless. Miriam stood and crossed to her trunk. The lock had bent when Pike threw it from the stage. She worked a hairpin into the damaged catch until it sprang open. Inside lay 3 work shifts, a brush, a small Bible that had belonged to her father, and a leather tool roll wrapped in oilcloth. Beneath them was the brown wool dress she had wanted to wear on the journey. The money envelope was still hidden under the lining. She opened it. 2 silver dollars and a railroad meal token slid into her palm. She had left Missouri with $9. Miriam checked the seams, though she already knew what she would find. The lining had been cut and sewn shut with pale thread. Someone opened it. Silas came close enough to see, but did not take the envelope from her. Pike? Perhaps. Or Greeley, before he handed me the ticket. Enough to get down the pass when the weather clears? Not unless the railroad accepts buttons. Silas looked toward the window. Snow pressed against the lower panes. Beyond the glass, the trail had vanished beneath a smooth white slope. The pass won't clear today. How long? Could be a week. Could be May. It was early November. Miriam put the coins back in the envelope. Then I am precisely what Greeley intended. Too far from anyone to refuse. No. The force of the word stopped her. Silas took one of the letters, leaned over the stove, and held the lower corner to the flame. Miriam caught his wrist before the paper ignited. He went still beneath her hand. Don't burn evidence. His gaze shifted from her face to her fingers around his sleeve. She released him. After a moment, Silas laid the letter down. What do you propose? It was the first time since her arrival that anyone had asked. Miriam returned to the table and sat. She arranged the 2 letters square with the wood grain, giving herself time to think. I cannot go down the mountain until there is a road. I cannot return to Missouri on $2, and even if I could, the shop is gone. My brothers sold the forge, the wheel forms, and every seasoned length of ash father stored. They say the property passed to them because I am a daughter. Did it? Father's will divided the business equally among the 3 of us. Then they stole from you. They called it managing the estate. Silas's mouth tightened. Men use cleaner words when they want dirt to look respectable. Miriam glanced at him. It was the longest sentence he had spoken that morning. She folded her hands. You expected labor. I did. You said last night that Greeley described me as good with accounts and strong enough for winter. He did. Were those the reasons you agreed? Silas leaned back. The chair creaked. 2 years ago, I came home from the North Line with a fever and a hand too stiff to strike a match. Lost half my stored meat because I couldn't tend the smokehouse. Last winter, a chimney seam cracked while I was gone. Another day and the roof would have burned. His eyes moved to the stove as if measuring old damage. I can trap. I can pack freight. I can read weather better than most men read print. But one person can't be in 2 places, and winter collects payment for every mistake. Miriam understood that language. A warped hub did not care whether the wheelwright had honorable intentions. An unpaid account did not shrink because a family was grieving. What work? Meals, cleaning, inventory, firewood when I'm gone, mending if you know it, keeping the stove and chimney sound. I can do more than that. I don't know what you can do. Then you can find out before assigning my value. A flicker crossed his eyes. Not offense. Interest, Miriam continued. I worked in Vale wheel and carriage from the time I could lift a spoke shave. I can fit a hub, set an iron tire, repair a runner, splice rope, sharpen tools, and keep freight books. I cooked because someone had to. It was never my trade. Silas looked at her tool roll. Those yours? My father's. Then mine. Your brothers let you keep them. They thought they were kitchen knives. The corner of his mouth shifted, almost but not quite a smile. He pulled a sheet of paper from a ledger near the wall. The page had writing on one side. Miriam turned it over to the blank back. Terms first, she said. Silas sat again. 6 months, he said. Or until the lower road opens, whichever comes first. No, until the road opens and I have enough money to leave it. He considered that. Fair. $8 a month, as promised in your letter. No deductions for the journey. Greeley was already paid for it twice. 10. Miriam studied him. Why? If you can do half of what you said, 8 is low. If I cannot, then we revise after 2 weeks. She nodded. Food and lodging are separate from wages. Yes. I choose where I sleep. The bed is yours. I can build a bunk behind the stove. You will not resent losing your own bed and count it as debt later. His face hardened. I don't keep secret accounts. Most people do. I don't. She held his gaze until she believed that he believed himself. Whether it remained true would be proven in time. No touching without permission, she said. Silas nodded once. No claim of marriage, not spoken, written, or implied to anyone who comes here. Another nod. If either of us decides the arrangement must end before the thaw, we say why. No one is put outside in dangerous weather. Yes, my wages remain mine. Yes, my name remains mine. Silas looked down at the false signature. Yes. Miriam drew the ink bottle closer. And if I improve equipment or help increase the value of your freight, we discuss a share beyond wages before the work is done. This time he took longer. How large a share? That depends on the work. That sounds like an argument waiting for spring. It sounds like negotiation. His eyes lifted to hers. Then he gave a slow nod. Put it in. Miriam wrote in a compact hand, shaped by years of fitting numbers into narrow ledger columns. She left no generous spaces where another sentence might later be inserted. She dated the agreement and listed the food stores already present in the cabin, so neither could claim she had arrived owing for them. Silas watched without interrupting. When she finished, she turned the page toward him. He read every line. You left out household obedience, he said. So I did. That almost smile appeared again and stayed a fraction longer. Silas signed first. His handwriting was plain and forceful, the letters pressed deep enough to mark the page beneath. He passed her the pen. Miriam held it over the final line. For 11 months, men had signed receipts for her father's tools. They had signed the deed transferring the shop. Walter had signed the broker's form, where Miriam's consent should have been. Greeley had written another man's name after hers and called it an agreement. She set the nib to paper. Miriam Vale. No borrowed title. No promised surname. No relation used in place of her own authority. Silas sanded the ink, folded the page, and cut it cleanly in half along the center crease. One for you, he said. Miriam took her copy. What now? Silas looked toward the iron stove. A thin thread of smoke leaked from the collar where the pipe entered the wall. Now, he said, you tell me whether you can fix that before it poisons us. Miriam followed the smoke with her eyes, then looked at the cold joint, the warped collar, and the soot stain spreading above it. I can. She tucked the agreement inside her tool roll. For the first time since her father's death, her labor had terms, her name had weight, and both belonged to her. The stove began coughing smoke before breakfast was finished. At first, it was only a thin gray ribbon slipping from the collar where the pipe entered the wall. Then the fire drew hard, the metal gave a dull pop, and smoke rolled into the room. Silas crossed the cabin and opened the damper. "Don't," Miriam said. His hand stopped. If the flue is narrowed above the collar, opening it wider will feed the fire and pull more heat into the blockage. Silas looked at the smoke thickening near the rafters. "You certain?" "No, but I would rather be uncertain with the fire starved." She shut the stove vents, wrapped a wet cloth around her mouth, and crouched beside the pipe. The iron was too hot to touch. Soot feathered the seam where the collar met the wall, but the leak itself was not large enough to explain the room filling so quickly. "Bucket," she said. Silas brought one. Snow, not water. He returned with it packed white. Miriam shoveled snow over the stovetop. Steam hissed upward as the fire lost heat. Silas opened the cabin door. Wind shoved the smoke sideways and sent loose papers across the table. Miriam pointed to the ledger and their agreement. "Secure those." He did. The fire settled to a red glow. Miriam pulled on gloves and loosened the screws at the collar. One had been driven crooked, biting only halfway into the metal. The pipe shifted when she pressed it. "This was fitted too tight against the wall," she said. "Metal expands when heated. It had nowhere to move. I set it last fall." "With a cold pipe?" "Yes. That is the trouble." Silas stood behind her, silent enough that she could feel him deciding whether to be offended. Miriam removed the collar. The section behind it was blackened and warped. A crescent crack ran along the lower seam. "That leaks smoke," Silas said. "It also leaks sparks." His gaze moved to the pine wall. Miriam reached into the gap with a file. Something brittle crumbled inside. A wad of moss chinking dropped onto the floor. Its inner edge was charred. Silas's face changed. How close? Close enough that the wall has been smoldering. He pried away more chinking. Beneath it, one timber held a narrow burned channel. The wood was warm under Miriam's glove. Silas swore once. Miriam packed snow against the timber until steam stopped rising. "Bring me a hammer, the narrow cold chisel, and whatever sheet iron you have. There's a flattened flour tin. Too thin. Stove plate from the old box outside. That may do." Silas pulled on his coat and disappeared into the snow. Miriam inspected the rest of the pipe. The upper section had sagged, because one support strap had torn loose. The stove sat uneven on the floorboards, forcing the pipe to bear weight it had not been designed to carry. The danger was not one bad seam. It was a chain of small neglects, each leaning on the next. She knew that kind of structure. When Silas returned with an iron plate, Miriam had drawn a plan on the back of Greeley's envelope. He set the metal down. "Tell me. We cut this into a shield and mount it with spacers so air can move behind it. Then we shorten the lower pipe, refit the seam, and hang the upper run from 2 points. I don't have a tin snip. You have a cold chisel and a saw file. That will take hours. So would rebuilding the cabin." He looked at the drawing, then placed the plate on the workbench. "Where do you want the cut? Not where should I cut it. Where do you want it?" Miriam marked the line with chalk. They worked through the morning. Silas held the plate while Miriam scored it with the chisel. The blows rang through the cabin. When her bruised feet began to ache, she shifted her stance. Silas noticed, slid a low block beneath one boot, and said nothing. They bent the edge over the workbench. Miriam used square nails as spacers, trapping the heads between shield and wall so air could rise behind the iron. Silas followed her measurements exactly. He did not improve them without asking or take the hammer when the work became awkward. By noon, the shield stood between the stovepipe and the timber. The pipe hung level from two forged straps. Miriam packed the outer gap with damp clay and ash instead of moss. Silas examined the joint. Will it hold? It will move when it heats instead of tearing itself open. He rebuilt the fire a handful of kindling at a time. Miriam held her palm near the new seam. No smoke touched her skin. The draft caught. Heat climbed the pipe. The iron expanded with faint ticks, but the collar stayed seated. Behind the shield, cool air rose through the gap. Silas watched for several minutes before closing the door. "You saved the place," he said. "I repaired a stove. You found fire in the wall. Because smoke was in the room. I saw the smoke every cold morning last winter." Miriam wiped soot from her knuckles and decided it was ordinary. "I decided the cabin was badly built. The cabin is sound. The pipe was asking the wall to carry it." He glanced at her. "What?" "Nothing. That was not nothing. That was not nothing." His gaze moved over the supports. "You talk about iron and timber as though they have intentions. They have limits. People call it failure when a thing finally does what the strain has been forcing it to do." Silas's expression went still. Miriam regretted the sentence. It sounded too much like confession. She began gathering tools. Silas took the broom and swept soot from around her boots. "I'll remember that," he said. He did not ask her to explain. That afternoon, the sky cleared enough for sunlight to strike the clearing, turning every drift into glare. Silas carried a narrow freight sled from the shed and set it upside down near the porch. One runner curved true, the other kicked outward at the nose. "Hit a buried rock last spring," he said. "I planned to steam it straight." Miriam crouched beside it. The runner was ash, old but sound. A split had opened near the front crosspiece, and someone had driven 2 nails through the grain. She looked at Silas. "You?" "No." "Good." His mouth shifted. "The nails stop the split from opening," he said. "They also force it farther along the grain." "Pull them." He knelt opposite her and worked the first nail free with pincers. His left hand slipped once. The tool clicked against the runner. Miriam kept her attention on the split. Silas changed hands and removed the second nail. "The ash is dry," she said. "Steam may bend it, but it will spring back. We need to open the break, clean it, pin it across the grain, and brace the nose while it cools." "Can you do it without new ash?" "Yes, if your drill is narrow enough." He fetched an auger, hide glue, rawhide strips, and straight-grained maple. Miriam shaved 2 pegs slightly oval. "Why oval?" Silas asked. "So they cannot turn inside the runner when the wood works." He nodded. They heated water in a hollowed log and fed hot stones into it until steam rose around the bent runner. Miriam wrapped the wood in wet sacking. While they waited, she examined the cross pieces. "The front bed is too narrow for your supply boxes." "It fits. When they are empty, loaded, the weight sits outside the runners. That is why the nose twists." Silas rested his forearms on his knees. "What would you change?" "Move the front crosspiece back 4 inches and add a diagonal brace. It will shorten the bed but keep the load over the track." I need the length for pelts. Then widen the rack above the runners. A sled should not be punished because the freight is poorly arranged. He looked from her to the sled. How long? Today for the runner, another day for the rack. Do it. Miriam raised an eyebrow. That quickly? You found a fire I lived beside for a year. I am learning. The answer warmed something in her more effectively than praise. When the ash had softened, they set the bent nose against a spruce stump. Miriam rigged a rope from the runner to a porch post, using a short stick as a Spanish windlass. Silas reached for it. She put a hand over the stick. Slowly. If you hurry, it will fracture. I know how to pull a sled. This is not pulling. This is persuasion. He released it. Miriam turned the stick a quarter rotation at a time. The rope tightened. The runner creaked beneath the wet sacking. Another quarter, Silas said. Not yet. They waited. The wood yielded by degrees. Once the curve matched the sound runner, Miriam opened the split with a wedge, cleaned out the dirt, and worked hide glue into the gap. Silas held the pieces aligned while she drilled 2 holes across the grain. Cold had stiffened the fingers of his left hand. She saw the tremor when he tightened his grip. Ease the pressure, she said. I have it. The split is closing unevenly. His jaw set. Miriam did not look at his hand. She pointed to the far side of the runner. Brace your forearm there. Use the bone, not the fingers. He adjusted. The wood settled true. Better, she said, as if correcting a clamp. Silas's eyes stayed on her face for a moment. Then he nodded. She drove the pegs through the runner, trimmed them flush, and wrapped the nose with wet rawhide. It would shrink as it dried and hold the wood under steady pressure. They left the sled braced until sunset. When Miriam released the rope, the runner kept its shape. Silas turned the sled upright and pushed it across the packed snow. Both runners cut parallel lines. He loaded 2 sacks of grain and a crate of traps onto the bed. The repaired nose remained straight. Again, Miriam said. He dragged it the length of the clearing and back. The sled moved without fighting him. At the porch, Silas set down the tow rope. I have a cache 6 miles north, he said. Flour, salt, cartridges, lamp oil. I plan to bring it in before the next storm. When? Day after tomorrow, if the weather holds. That gives us tomorrow for the rack. It gives us tomorrow for you to rest. My feet are sore, not broken. You nearly froze yesterday. And today, I kept your wall from catching fire and repaired your runner. Silas studied her, then glanced toward the ridge. 6 miles there, mostly uphill. The return is heavier. You need someone to keep the load centered. I do. It was not permission disguised as concern. It was an admission of fact. Then I am coming, Miriam said. Silas picked up the tow rope and placed it in her hand. Tomorrow we build the rack. The next morning you plan the load. The rope was rough and warm from his grip. I'll need to see every box before I plan anything. You will, and I decide the order. You do. The last light caught on the repaired runner, showing no bend where the split had been. Behind them, the stove drew cleanly. No smoke marked the wall. 2 mornings later, Miriam tightened the final rope across the loaded sled and told Silas he had packed the lamp oil in the wrong place. He stood on the far side of the new rack, one mitten resting on a crate of traps. It is tied down. That does not make it well placed. If a cork works loose on the descent, we eat lamp oil until spring. Where? Between the blankets, upright. He moved the bottles without argument. The rack they had built rose just beyond the runners. wide enough for pelts, but braced inward so the weight sat over the track. Miriam tested the cross-lashing, then looked toward the western peaks. A pale veil hung above them. Silas noticed. Weather? High cloud. Snow by tomorrow night, wind first. He pointed toward the firs above the clearing. The air near the cabin was still, but the highest branches leaned east. Wind above us, Miriam said. Coming down. He handed her ash-framed snowshoes. He had shortened the tails and shifted the bindings to match her stride. You altered these. They were built for me. You could have told me. You would have stopped working on the sled to do it yourself. That is possible. Silas tightened his own straps. If you fall, fall uphill. If you hear a hollow sound beneath the snow, stop. If I raise a fist, do not take another step. And if I see something you miss, you say it. They left with Miriam managing the drag rope behind the sled. The repaired runners whispered over the packed trail. For the first mile, Silas planted each foot where the crust would hold. He avoided the dark hollows around buried logs and showed her where a porcupine had stripped bark 3 nights earlier. Miriam listened. When the sled began pulling left on a side slope, she shifted a flour sack uphill and shortened the rear line. You knew before it slid, he said. I felt the rope change. Near midday, they reached a wind-scoured saddle. The trail narrowed between a rock wall and a slope dropping into timber. Silas raised his fist. Miriam stopped. He brushed powder from a hairline crack across the trail. Old slab. We cross one at a time. He anchored the sled, crossed, and secured a second rope from the far side. Miriam followed. The snow gave a low, settling sigh beneath her left foot. She froze. Move your right foot downhill 6 inches, Silas called. That seems backward. It spreads the load. She obeyed. The crust held. When she reached him, he untied the sled. You listened. You told me what the movement would accomplish. I did not. You gave me enough to understand. His mouth shifted. That counts? It does to me. The northern cache stood beneath a granite shelf where 3 pines grew from one root bed. They dug out the door and found flour, salt, beans, oil, cartridges, 2 bundles of traps, and a packet of mail from the trading post. A folded bill bore Amos Greeley's blue stamp. Silas turned it face down. What is it? Miriam asked. Nothing useful. Then show me. The bill claimed $28 for marital placement, legal preparation, and conveyance of Mrs. Rourke. Payment was due by spring. If unpaid, Greeley threatened to transfer the balance to an agent authorized to recover the contracted value of services rendered. He is building a paper trail, Miriam said. Silas took the page. He is building a fire. No, fires destroy evidence. She folded it with the other letters inside her coat. You think paper will stop him? He asked. I think it will show other people what he has done. Other people often prefer not to see. Then we make it expensive to look away. A week ago she had been counting coins and measuring the distance to the nearest road. Now she spoke of spring as though she expected to reach it standing. Silas nodded. Keep the bill. They inventoried the cash. Halfway through, Silas dropped his pencil. He stooped, but his left hand failed to close. The pencil rolled beneath a crate. His last 2 fingers moved only slightly. Miriam turned toward the flour sacks. We should use the smaller ledger at the cabin, she said. This one wastes paper. Silas remained crouched. She checked the stitching on a grain sack as though she had seen nothing. After a moment, he retrieved the pencil with his right hand and stood. When the sled was loaded, The sky had dulled and wind hissed through the saddle. Silas took the tow rope, but the knot slipped from his left hand. "I will pull first," Miriam said. "No, you taught me the trail coming in. The descent is harder, and your hand is cold." Silas faced her. Shame was harder and quieter than anger. "It works. Not well enough for a tow rope. I have managed it for 2 winters. You also lived beside a burning wall. This is not a contest over who can ignore damage longest." Wind moved between them. Then he held out the rope. Miriam fitted it across her shoulders. "You managed the brake line with your right hand." They descended by stages. Miriam leaned into the harness on level ground and let the sled press against her on the slopes, while Silas controlled its speed. Neither thanked the other. The work itself carried the meaning. At the saddle, the slab crack had widened. "We go below," Silas said. "Through the trees? Longer, safer. Darkness would catch them before the cabin." Miriam studied the load. "We leave the trap bundles. Steel is worth more than flour. Steel does not keep us alive this week." Silas looked at the sky. "Lamp oil too? 1 bottle comes." They buried the excess beneath a marked pine. Miriam recorded its distance from the rock wall, and the lighter sled moved into the trees. Darkness caught them a mile from home. Silas lit a hooded lantern. His left hand had become rigid. Miriam stopped beside a fallen cedar. "Warm it." "We need to move. You cannot feel the brake line." "I can feel enough." She stepped in front of him. "Silas." The use of his name halted him. Miriam untied the scarf from her neck. "Put your hand beneath your coat. I will secure it against your ribs." He stared at the scarf. "I am not asking to see the injury. It is not an injury. Call it whatever lets you accept help before we lose the sled." Finally, Silas placed his hand inside his coat. Miriam wrapped the scarf around his torso, binding the forearm close enough to share his body heat. She touched only cloth. "Too tight?" "No." "Can you breathe fully?" "Yes." They resumed with Silas using his right hand on the brake line. The cabin appeared through the trees well after dark, its single window glowing behind frost. Miriam had banked the stove before they left. The sight of that light struck her with an emotion she did not name. Inside, Silas stood near the stove, while feeling returned to his fingers in painful pulses. Miriam hung their coats and heated water. "You may ask," he said. She turned. He sat at the table, left forearm on the wood. "I was not going to. That is why you may." Miriam poured coffee. "What happened?" "My brother Caleb and I carried army freight before I trapped. 3 winters ago, we took medicine over Granite Neck, after the lower road washed out. I chose the upper shelf because it saved half a day." His thumb crossed the scar near his wrist. "The slope broke. Rope caught my hand against a rock. Caleb went under. Did you find him?" "In April." The answer contained an entire winter. "I am sorry. I kept pulling after the rope crushed the nerves. Thought if I held on I could keep him near the surface." He flexed the trembling fingers. There was nothing on the other end by then. Miriam did not offer easy absolution. "You chose a route," she said. "The mountain chose the rest. I knew the shelf was unstable. And Caleb knew too. He went with you." "He went with you?" "Yes. Then he made a choice beside yours." Silas looked up. "My father died under a wagon he should not have repaired alone," Miriam said. "I had gone to collect a debt. Walter said if I had stayed, I could have held the axle. For months I rebuilt that afternoon with myself in every place at once. What stopped you? Nothing. I simply grew tired of living inside a machine that could never be repaired. His gaze rested on her with a steadiness that no longer felt like scrutiny. Needing another set of hands is not the same as failing, she said. And losing them? That is not the same as never having had them. The stove ticked as it heated. Silas closed his left hand. The fingers still trembled, but they obeyed. "Tomorrow," he said, "you show me how to change the tow harness for 2 people." Miriam understood the size of the offer. Not apology, not a promise that fear was gone, a redesign. "I will." Outside, snow tapped softly against the window. Inside, the 2 copies of their agreement rested in separate places, but the work between them had already become something no paper had required. 3 weeks later, the 2-person harness carried them beyond the North Ridge, just as the snow beneath Silas's leading foot broke away. The sound was soft and deep, as if the mountain had taken a breath. Silas vanished to the waist. "Miriam, back!" She threw herself uphill. The harness jerked across her chest as the shelf under him split from the ridge. A slab of snow slid outward, carrying Silas with it. The rope snapped tight. Miriam hit both knees. The harness dragged her forward until the iron teeth of her snowshoes caught buried crust. 20 feet below, Silas struck a ledge and disappeared in powder. "Silas!" "I'm here." His voice came strained from below the broken lip. Miriam crawled toward a spruce leaning away from the ravine. The rope cut into her ribs. "Stop," Silas called. "The edge is hollow." She froze 6 feet from it. Beyond the torn cornice, the slope fell into a gorge filled with black timber. Silas hung against a shelf no wider than a workbench. His right boot had found stone. His left leg dangled over open air. One arm lay at an unnatural angle. "Your shoulder." Out. The sled rested behind Miriam on firmer ground, half loaded with flour, salt, and the trap bundles they had returned to recover. Silas's line pulled from her right side, turning her toward the gorge. He looked up and judged the angle. "Cut me loose." "No. The shelf is breaking." A piece of snow dropped from beneath his boot and vanished. "If it goes, you go with me." Miriam drew the knife at her belt. Relief and grief crossed his face together. Instead of cutting his line, she sliced the cords securing the sled. The sacks rolled free. One split, spilling flour across the snow. She shoved the trap bundles downhill on the safe side of the ridge. "What are you doing?" "Reducing what can pull me." "Miriam, save your breath." She knocked the retaining pin from the sled and dragged out the axle. The shared rope was too short, so she took the spare line, looped it around the spruce, and passed it over the axle to make a crude turning drum. Silas watched her rig it. "The tree is uphill of you." "I know. If it tears loose, complain after I pull you up." A crack ran beneath the cornice. Silas's ledge dropped an inch. The rope tore a sound from his throat. Miriam jammed the sled crosswise behind a buried root. She tied the hauling line to her harness, crawled downhill until it drew tight, and turned her back to the tree. Her body would be the counterweight. The sled and root would hold if her footing failed. "On my pull," she said, "use your right leg. Do not reach with the injured arm. You cannot haul me alone." "I am not alone. You still have one leg." "Miriam, push." She stepped downhill. The rope tightened over the axle. Silas rose a few inches, his coat scraping the broken snow face. His boot slipped. He fell back against the ledge. The force drove Miriam forward until the harness crushed the breath from her lungs. The spruce groaned. She held. Again. Silas found the rock with his heel. Miriam bent her knees and leaned into the line. Years of lifting wheel rims and bracing wagon bodies gathered into one motion. Silas pushed. The rope moved a handspan, then another. Snow poured over his shoulders. His injured arm hung useless, but his right hand found a root in the cornice wall. Hold. I'm holding. Miriam advanced one short step and took another length around the axle. The ledge cracked. Silas dropped. The line burned through her gloves. Her boots broke the crust and sank. The sled shifted behind her, runner grinding against the root. For one terrible second, nothing held. Then Miriam's hips struck the harness. Her weight settled low. The sled stopped. Silas swung beneath the broken edge. "Miriam, I have you." His face lifted toward her. Snow streaked the scar along his jaw. There was no argument left in his eyes. "What do you need?" Right foot against the wall. Find stone. He searched with his boot. Found it. When I pull, climb. Miriam wrapped the line around her forearm, turned sideways, and drove upward with both legs. Silas climbed. The rope crept over the axle. Her shoulders shook. Somewhere behind her, wood splintered, but the anchor held. His hand appeared over the lip. Miriam released the hauling line, crawled forward until the snow beneath her elbows sounded solid, and seized his wrist. His weight dragged her half a foot. She flattened herself against the slope. "Kick!" He kicked. Miriam hauled backward. Silas came over the edge in a rush of snow and collapsed across her legs. The cornice broke again. A white wall peeled away where he had been hanging and thundered into the gorge. Miriam locked both arms around his coat until the mountain went quiet. Neither moved for several breaths. Then Silas rolled onto his back. His face had gone gray. "Can you stand?" Miriam asked. "Yes. That was not what you asked me when I reached the cabin." His eyes opened fully. "No," he said, "I cannot." She checked his head and shoulder. The joint bulged forward, but his pulse was steady. "We need shelter. Line shack east of the ravine, 1/2 mile. Can you walk it?" "With help." Miriam cut the damaged harness from him and tied the injured arm to his chest. She recovered one flour sack, the medical roll, 2 blankets, the lantern, and food. Everything else remained on the slope. Silas looked toward the lost traps. "Leave them," she said. He nodded. She moved beneath his good arm. He gave her as little weight as possible, which was still too much on the first rise. "Use me." "I am." "No, you are pretending." His jaw tightened. "You asked for another set of hands," Miriam said. "These are them." Silas leaned into her. The line shack appeared near dusk, its low roof buried beneath hemlock. Miriam dug out the door with a broken board and forced the latch. Inside stood a narrow bunk, a rusted stove, and enough dry wood for one night. She lit the stove, spread a blanket, and helped Silas sit. His breath caught when she loosened the sling. The shoulder must go back before it swells. "I know. I have set axles, not men." Same principle, worse language. A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Silas looked at her, as though the sound had reached some place the fall had left untouched. She looped folded cloth beneath his arm and braced a boot against the bunk. "I will pull steadily. Tell me if your right hand goes numb." "It won't." "Ready?" "Yes." Miriam drew the arm outward. Slow and firm, Silas's face emptied of everything but endurance. The joint slid back with a dull knock. He sagged against the wall. She retied the sling and covered him. Only then did she sit on the floor beside the bunk. Her hands had begun to shake. Silas watched them. You built that rig in minutes. It nearly failed. It did not. You told me to cut you loose. Yes. You will not do that again. If the choice is both of us, it was not yours alone. Miriam leaned forward. You do not get to turn sacrifice into command. Not with me. The flame moved behind the stove's cracked window. At last Silas said, All right. You mean it? I mean, I will ask before deciding how you are allowed to risk yourself. It was not a perfect promise. It was honest enough to build on. Miriam rested her head against the bunk frame. Outside, wind gathered over the ridge they had escaped. Inside the shack, Silas's shoulder was set. The fire was growing, and the rope between them had become something neither of them could cut without the other's consent. Sometime after midnight, Silas woke from a fevered dream, with Caleb's name caught in his throat, and Miriam's hand resting beside his on the blanket. She had fallen asleep sitting against the bunk. When he moved, her eyes opened at once. You are safe, she said. Silas looked at the low roof, the stove, and the sling holding his arm. His breathing slowed. I felt the rope go, he said. For a moment, I was back on Granite Neck. Miriam waited. I told you to cut me loose because I could not watch it happen twice. You thought saving me meant making the choice for me. Yes. And now? His gaze settled on her hand. Now, I know the frightening part was not falling. His voice roughened. It was knowing how much of my life was standing above me. Miriam drew her hand back, unsure whether he was offering closeness or warning her away. Silas caught the movement. I do not want less of you, he said. I am afraid of having something I can lose. So am I. He lifted his good hand, then stopped before touching her. May I? Miriam leaned forward and placed his palm against her cheek. The kiss came slowly. There was no claim in it, only the careful recognition of two people who had trusted each other with weight, pain, and the right to refuse. When they parted, Silas rested his forehead against hers. No promises made in a storm, Miriam whispered. No promises until spring, he agreed. They returned to the cabin 2 days later. Winter did not soften for them, but its work became shared. Miriam rebuilt the tow harness. Silas learned to say when his hand had gone numb. They recovered enough pelts to pay the season's costs, and Miriam kept every bill from Greeley folded with the 2 contradictory letters. By April, meltwater ran beneath the snow, and the lower road opened in strips of mud. They took the freight sled to Nell Corbett's trading post on the first morning a wagon could climb the grade. Amos Greeley was waiting inside. He wore a city coat too fine for the room and held a leather portfolio beneath one arm. 4 traders stood near the counter. Nell Corbett watched from behind a row of coffee tins. Greeley smiled when Miriam entered. Mrs. Rourke, I feared the winter had made you difficult to recover. My name is Miriam Vale. Names are easily corrected. He opened the portfolio. Mr. Rourke owes $28. If he cannot satisfy the balance, your contracted service transfers to my company until the debt is cleared. Silas placed a pouch of winter earnings on the counter. How much ends it? Miriam put her hand over the pouch. No. Silas looked at her. I will not be purchased out of a purchase. Greeley's smile thinned. You signed willingly. Miriam laid the 2 letters beside his contract. No. You promised him an employee and promised me a husband. You charged my family, charged Silas, and now charge us again. A misunderstanding. Then your records should explain it." She opened the ledger he had brought. Greeley reached for it, but Nell placed one hand on the cover. "Let her look," the widow said. Miriam turned to the freight entries. The numbers were neat, but the materials betrayed him. Rail fare from St. Louis had been entered twice. Pike's stage charge appeared under both Miriam's name and Silas's account. A legal sealing fee had been listed for a document bearing the stamp of Vale Wheel and Carriage. Miriam touched the mark. "This seal belonged to my father's shop. Greeley bought it with the scrap tools my brothers sold him. He used it here to make the contract look witnessed." Greeley scoffed. "You cannot prove that. I cut that die myself when father's old seal cracked. The lower spoke has 7 grooves because my file slipped. Your stamp has the same flaw." Nell bent over the page. "It does." Miriam pointed to the inked freight totals. "And these charges cannot be true. He billed 30 pounds of legal paper and sealing wax on a coach that Pike's own manifest lists as full before St. Louis. Either the freight record is false or the stage record is." One of the traders took off his spectacles and examined the columns. "Same ticket number twice," he said. Another trader opened Greeley's packet and found 3 women's names attached to repeated rail receipts. The room changed. Greeley no longer faced one isolated woman and one mountain trapper. He faced witnesses who recognized a pattern. Nell pulled the fraudulent contract toward her. "This post will honor no claim based on forged signatures," she said. "You can leave now or wait for the circuit judge next month." Greeley looked at Silas, perhaps expecting violence. Silas did not move. Miriam held out her hand. "My letters." Greeley surrendered the portfolio. She removed every page bearing her name, then placed the false contract in the stove. The paper curled black around the forged signature. Silas left the money pouch closed. Outside, wagons creaked through spring mud. Miriam stood on the porch with enough wages to travel east, and no legal paper compelling her in either direction. Silas came beside her but did not touch her. "What do you choose?" he asked. "The cabin," she said. "The roots. The work we have not built yet." His eyes searched hers. "And you," she added, "if you still want a partner who writes her own terms." "I do." "Then both names go on the property books, profits divided after costs. Decisions affecting both of us require both of us." "Agreed. And if we marry, it will be because we walk to a magistrate together." Silas's scar shifted with his smile. Together. They signed a new partnership agreement at Nell's counter. In June, they returned to the post and married before the circuit judge with no broker, no debt, and no borrowed promise between them. By autumn, a workshop stood beside the cabin. Silas had framed it, but Miriam set the braces and chose the height of the windows. Together they built a workbench fitted to the reach of her arms and the force of her stance. Above the door, she painted, "Vale and Rourke. Mountain freight and winter supply." When she stepped back, Silas handed her the brush for the final stroke. Miriam added the period after "supply" and looked through the open doorway at the bench, the ledgers, the repaired sleds, and the tools bearing her father's name. The room had not been made generous enough to tolerate her. It had been built for the life she had chosen. She entered without turning sideways.